Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Woman was written in 1792 and was hugely influential throughout the Romantic period. So the poets that we're reading in this course generally would have been familiar with this text. Mary Wollstonecraft herself was famous in her own time as a woman of scandal. She became the lover of the American Gilbert Imlay and mothered an illegitimate child by him, and then tried to kill herself when he abandoned her. But after that, she married the English radical William Godwin, who was one of the most famous radical writers of the dangerous post-revolutionary period in the 1790s. Godwin criticized the revolution only because of its violence, not because of its injustice. But they're probably both of them are most famous as the parents of Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, at that time Mary Godwin, and who would go on to elope with Percy Shelley and write Frankenstein, which itself includes a strong critique of gender ideology. After Wollstonecraft died in childbirth with Mary Shelley, Godwin published a rather notorious account of her life, including all the scandalous details, which enhanced her scandalous reputation and earned him a fair amount of criticism. So Wollstonecraft then was very much at the heart of the political discourses surrounding the French Revolution, and her attitudes towards these political issues gave rise to her radical feminist ideas. So her political importance goes beyond the single issue of women's rights. She was a radical in a variety of fields. But this text is one of the earliest comprehensive statements of feminist principles. And it sprang out of Wollstonecraft's initial political engagement with Edmund Burke, entitled The Vindication of the Rights of Men. And in that earlier text, Wollstonecraft refuted Burke's claims that we are bound to follow the rules inherited from past generations. She argues instead that the fundamental rights of man derive from his capacity for improving his intellect and therefore moving beyond the limited customs of the past. So she bases her claims about basic human rights not simply on nature, but on the capacity for culture, for improvement. And this capacity is precisely what makes arbitrary power illegitimate in her eyes. She also argues against Burke that just because we've always done things a certain way, that doesn't make it right. So in the Vindication for the Rights of the Rights of Men, she gives the example of slavery. Just because our ignorant forefathers sanctioned slavery, this does not mean that we should do so, she says. Similarly, just because Burke's system of chivalry treated women as idealized objects of affection or mindless dolls, that doesn't make it right. Wollstonecraft's second vindication focuses on a more specific form of this injustice. It's not just the masses who've been deprived of opportunities for improvement, it's women in particular. So if women are treated as no more than the objects of masculine desire, they have no reason to develop themselves into useful citizens. So the Vindication of the Rights of Women is in a sense an extension of her original criticism of Burke, that the ways of the past are in fact harmful to human development and not beneficial to it. In her introduction, she singles out a false system of education based on the values of men who, considering females rather as women than human creatures, have been more anxious to make them alluring mistresses than affectionate wives and rational mothers. So she sees the inequities in the treatment of women, and it's significant that she focuses on education, since this is how this ideological hold is maintained. Women are subjugated not because they are inferior, but because they are taught to be inferior. And this tyrannical treatment of women has been justified in a number of ways, primarily by the argument that men and women are fundamentally different and ought to aspire to fundamentally different ideals. Wollstonecraft, however, invokes the Enlightenment ideal of universality to argue that women should be included within the supposedly universal Enlightenment subject. She says that if men accept that women have souls, they must also accept that there can be only one way to achieve virtue or happiness. She addresses this problem when she says how men worry about the emergence of masculine women. But if masculinity is supposed to mean the imitation of manly virtues, or more properly speaking, the attainment of those talents and virtues, the exercise of which ennobles the human character, then surely those are things that women should aspire to as well. So the justification for not allowing women to develop themselves is based on this stereotypical idea of female vices, that they are silly and headstrong, and thus cannot be properly educated. Wollstonecraft explains that this is not the product of nature, but of culture. Women have been educated to behave in a particular way. It's not their essential characters that is shown in that. So, like many of the Romantic poets, Wollstonecraft is interested in demystifying the ideological workings of culture, whereby specific cultural formations come to appear as though they are natural. She surmises that the opinion that woman was created for man probably derives from the fact that man in the ancient past found it convenient to exert his strength to subjugate his companion. In other words, she supposes a historical origin for a supposedly natural fact, thus demystifying the ideology of male superiority. Men's physical strength has often been cited as a sign of their right to superiority, but while Wollstonecraft acknowledges this physical strength, she also points to the difference between natural superiority and rational superiority. Following Rousseau and other radical thinkers, Wollstonecraft does not accept that might makes right. The superior person is the one who develops his or her mind in the direction of reason. Quote, when improvable reason is allowed to be the dignified distinction which raises men above the brute creation and puts a natural scepter in a feeble hand, end quote. Men accept that reason is what raises us above the animals, but refuse to give women the power to develop their reason. Moreover, the masculine desire to cultivate physically appealing women rather than intelligent and capable ones means that women become equivalent to animals or children. And this too is paradoxical in that men expect their wives to have enough practical knowledge to run their households, but do not care enough to help them learn this. So, to get back to her main point, Wollstonecraft argues that women have been constructed as weak, silly creatures by a patriarchal ideology for so long that both men and women start to believe that this is how they naturally are. In short, it is because women have been denied access to culture as defined by a masculinist Enlightenment tradition that they have therefore been constructed as standing outside this tradition and associated with nature instead. What is needed then, Wollstonecraft suggests, is a more wholesale revaluation of the assumptions of culture. One of the most important figures with whom she contends is Rousseau, whom I've mentioned briefly in this course already. Rousseau was revolutionary and wrote The Social Contract, which she generally approves of, but he also wrote Emile, which was a treatise on education. And Emile presents the ideal of education as not being inside, just being made to read books, so much like Wordsworth, up and quit your books, but to experience life and learn practical lessons from it. The problem with this for Wollstonecraft is that Rousseau makes it a specifically masculine ideal of education. When he comes to detailing feminine education, he reverts to convention and says that women should be taught only those skills calculated to please others, to be refined. Moreover, while he believes that men's natures are virtuous, he does not believe the same of women. Despite his attempts to demystify the appearance that subordination of certain classes is natural, his insight does not extend to women. He feels that women are naturally cunning and therefore have to have their natural impulses restrained in order to please men. So she criticizes the way in which Rousseau and many others at this time conceived of female education. On 4 basic grounds. Number 1, it lacks order and therefore cannot effectively cultivate virtue and reason, which produces instinctive common sense never brought to the test of reason. Wollstonecraft's alluding to the fact that women were rarely given a formal education. If they were taught, it was often because they happened to have brothers who were being tutored, and the parents would then allow the daughters of the house to take lessons with the sons. Number 2, specific practical goals are always valued over the real cultivation of reason. The cultivation of understanding is always subordinate to the development of some corporeal accomplishment. In other words, women are taught to sing, play musical instruments, do needlework, and not the rational and intellectual pursuits. Number 3, it inculcates the appearance of virtue, but does not teach how to know what is virtuous. So again, the idea of cultivating a pleasing appearance for men, but without teaching them how or why that is virtuous. And finally, in short, the goal is simply to render them pleasing to men. So, like Rousseau, Wollstonecraft believes that reason is based on nature, but that cultivation must go beyond the simply natural. Wollstonecraft's argument is based on extending the supposedly universal principles of Enlightenment reason to include women. Wollstonecraft is still concerned with the cultivation of virtue, so she's certainly informed by the Enlightenment version of culture as an idea of moral development, but she seeks to radically shift the ground for this development from what she sees as a false cultivation to nature. So she argues that it is a farce to call any being virtuous whose virtues do not result from the exercise of its own reason. So women must not simply be told what to do, they must be shown why such an action is right. She compares women to soldiers because both are given very little learning before they're sent out into the world and get their experience only from a very narrow aspect of that world. Neither women nor soldiers are really allowed to develop their minds, and yet soldiers are still allowed more freedom than women are. Against Burke, she claims that virtue depends on an act of individual reason rather than conformity to the appearance of virtue. She says, I do not mean to add a paradox when I assert that this artificial weakness produces a propensity to tyrannize and gives birth to cunning, the natural opponent of strength, which leads them to play off those contemptible infantile airs that undermine esteem even whilst they excite desire. Note the affinities between the language she uses and the discourse of the Revolution. The power that women have in society is an illegitimate power, like that of tyrants, because it is based on false appearances. It's not that women are simply powerless under the masculine system, but that the kind of power they exert only debases them more. Women, in obtaining power by unjust means, by practicing or fostering vice, evidently lose the rank which reason would assign to them, and they become either abject slaves or capricious tyrants. Thus, the move towards a more equitable treatment of women is also a move towards justice in its wider sense. As she later points out, women have been duped by their lovers whilst dreaming they reigned over them. Women's power, then, is not only illegitimate, but illusory, since the rules of chivalry, which place women on pedestals, as Burke does, can be changed by men at any time. She advocates that women discard their gaudy hereditary trappings. The clothing imagery here used to suggest that for Wollstonecraft, true cultivation can only begin by discarding precisely those illusions that Burke wants to maintain. Wollstonecraft is thus, on the one hand, fully in agreement with those Enlightenment philosophers who saw reason as the only way forward for human culture. She just argues that women are just as capable of reason as men are. On the other hand, she also starts to point in the direction that the Romantics would soon follow by cultivating feeling in her readers and by emphasizing the emotions that lie at the heart of the experiences she describes. Notice, for example, that she begins our excerpt with an appeal to her feelings. It is because, quote, melancholy emotions of sorrowful indignation have depressed my spirits, that she takes up the task of writing. At the same time, she cautiously tries to avoid anything in her writing style that might be termed stereotypically feminine. She says, I aim at being useful, and sincerity will render me unaffected. For wishing rather to persuade by the force of my arguments than dazzle by the elegance of my language, I shall not waste my time in rounding periods. So she tends to restrain her language in the Vindications, although it's worth noting she also writes fiction, which is much more emotionally charged. For example, her most famous novel, Maria, or The Wrongs of Woman, which is also about the social oppression faced by women. In particular, the novel shows the injustice of English marriage laws, which essentially deprived a woman of her own identity and left her with little legal recourse, since divorce was very difficult at the time. Just a few questions to conclude with, and that we can talk about further in Moodle and on Teams. What are the benefits and drawbacks of Wollstonecraft basing her argument on the Enlightenment ideal of universal reason? Does the version of women's education that she advances lack anything that we might think is important? And what do you think contemporary feminists would perhaps find lacking in Wollstonecraft's very early formulation of feminist principles?